Seoul burns gold at dusk, and on the 42nd floor of Beak International, the air turns to ice the instant Camille Adeyemi opens her mouth. 11 men stop breathing. The chairman's jaw goes tight. Across the table, Baek Do-hyun, the man Forbes calls untouchable, the man 3 assistants quit on in a single year, lifts his eyes from his tablet for the first time in 2 hours. She has just called his numbers wrong, in front of the board, in front of his late father's portrait on the wall. And something in his chest, frozen since the funeral, cracks straight down the middle. Welcome back, loves. Get comfortable, because this one is going to wreck you a little, in the best way. If a story like this already has your heart doing something funny, go ahead and tap subscribe now so you do not miss the next one. Okay, let us get into it. The boardroom at Beak International did not tolerate mistakes, and it certainly did not tolerate interruptions. 12 floors below, the city moved in its usual obedient rhythm, taxis bleeding red light into wet pavement, vendors closing their stalls along Yoljiro. Up here, the only sound was the soft click of a laser pointer and the voice of Vice President Han, walking the board through projected returns on the Lagos shipping acquisition like a man reciting scripture. Camille sat at the far end of the table, third chair from the wall, which in Beak International's unspoken hierarchy meant she was barely in the room at all. She had been flown in from the New York office 11 days ago on a 6-month secondment, officially to support due diligence, unofficially to be seen and not heard. She had spent those 11 days proving she could be both useful and invisible. It had worked, until today. Han's slide showed projected margins climbing in a clean, confident arc. Camille's pen had stopped moving 4 minutes ago. She was staring at a single number, turning it over, checking it twice against the appendix nobody else seemed to have opened. Mr. Han. Her voice was quiet, but it landed in the room like a dropped glass. Your currency hedge assumption on slide 14 doesn't match the actual forward contracts in the appendix. You're modeling at 1401 to the dollar. The contracts Beak Trading actually signed lock-in at closer to 1520. Silence. The kind that has weight. Han's smile did not move, but his eyes did, flicking toward the head of the table. I think there may be some confusion about translated figures, Miss Adeyemi. There's no confusion. She slid her tablet forward, turned the screen so it faced the room instead of herself. A habit she had learned early in her career. Never let your evidence look like an accusation pointed at you. If we close this deal at the margins on your slide, Beak loses around $11 million in the first 18 months. If the board approves based on these numbers, that's the number you're approving. 11 men looked at their own copies of the appendix as if seeing them for the first time. Several had not, in fact, read past the executive summary. At the head of the table, Baek Do-hyun set down his pen. He had not said a single word in this meeting beyond his opening greeting, which was not unusual. Do-hyun had built a reputation in 8 years of running Beak International on saying almost nothing and missing almost nothing, a combination that made grown executives sweat through their shirts in his presence. He was 34 years old and already spoken of the way men twice his age wished to be spoken of, with a kind of careful, frightened respect. He had inherited the company from his father at 26, in the worst possible way, and had spent the years since turning grief into precision, because precision did not ask him how he was feeling. He looked, now, at the American woman at the far end of his table, the one his assistant had described in a single line in the new hire briefing. Capable, quiet, keeps to herself, and he felt something shift that he did not have a name for. "Pull the closing documents," he said. His voice was low, even, the voice he used when he had already made a decision and was simply informing the room of it. Now, in this meeting, Han's composure finally slipped. "Chairman Beak, this is a formality. I can have revised figures by tomorrow morning. You had 11 days. Do-hyun did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. It was somehow worse that he didn't. Miss Adeyemi found this in 11 minutes. He turned his head, and for the first time since she had walked into this building 11 days ago, Camille Adeyemi found herself the sole focus of Baek Do-hyun's attention. It was, she would think later, like standing in front of an open window in winter. Not cruel. Just cold enough to make you feel every place your coat had a gap. "Walk me through it," he said, not a request. "From the beginning, assume I know nothing." So she did. For 6 minutes, in a boardroom that had gone graveyard silent, Camille Adeyemi explained currency exposure and hedge contracts and margin compression to the most powerful 34-year-old in Korean shipping, and she did not once let her voice shake, though her hands, hidden beneath the table, had gone cold. When she finished, Do-hyun nodded once. "Han, redo the model. Miss Adeyemi will review it before it returns to this table." "Sir, she's a visiting analyst. She doesn't have authority to. She has it now." The meeting ended 4 minutes later. Men filed out murmuring to each other in low, urgent Korean, already reshaping the office gossip that would own this building by lunch. Camille gathered her tablet, her pen, the appendix nobody had read, and tried very hard to look like a woman who did this sort of thing every day, instead of a woman whose pulse had not slowed since the word currency had left her mouth. Miss Adeyemi. She turned. Du Haiyan had not left with the others. He stood at the head of the long table, jacket still buttoned, hands loose at his sides, watching her with an expression she could not yet read, because she did not yet know him well enough to know that this particular stillness, in this particular man, was the closest thing he had to wonder. Yes, Chairman Beek. Has dinner been arranged for the visiting analysts this week? It was such an odd sideways question that she blinked. I believe there's a team dinner Thursday. Cancel it for yourself. You'll eat with me tonight. 8 o'clock, the private room at Youngsik. We have details to discuss about the Lagos restructuring. It was not a question. Camille had spent 11 days learning that very little Baek Do-hyun said was ever phrased as a question, even when, underneath, it clearly was one. That's not really standard for a visiting analyst, sir. Something almost like amusement crossed his face, there and gone in a blink. Neither is correcting me in front of my own board. He picked up his folder. 8 o'clock. He left. Camille stood alone in the empty boardroom, sunlight sliding golden low across the long table, and felt, for reasons she could not yet name, that something in her carefully managed life had just quietly, irrevocably, come undone. By the time she reached her temporary office on the 30th floor, the rumor had already beaten her there. Her cubicle mate, a sharp-eyed associate named Una, who had adopted Camille within her first week, with the fierce, protective energy of someone who had also once been the only woman in a room of men twice her seniority, looked up with her eyebrows somewhere near her hairline. You told Chairman Beek he was wrong. In the board meeting. With Hans slides up. I corrected a modeling error. Kemi. Una set down her coffee like it had personally betrayed her. Nobody corrects Baek Do-hyun. People do not even make eye contact with Baek Do-hyun. Last year, a senior VP resigned because Do-hyun asked him one question in a meeting and he panicked and forgot the name of his own department. He didn't seem angry. That's worse. Una lowered her voice, glancing toward the glass-walled hallway as if the chairman might materialize from the elevators on cue. Angry, you can survive. Angry, he forgets about you in a week. Interested? She shook her head slowly. Interesting is how 3 executive assistants ended up in HR filing transfer requests within a month of starting. He's not cruel to them. He's just nothing. Polite, distant, impossible to read. They couldn't take it. Camille thought of the stillness in his face in the boardroom, the way his attention had landed on her like a held breath. He invited me to dinner, to discuss the Lagos numbers. Una's mouth fell open. She closed it, opened it again. He has never had dinner with an analyst. Ever. In 8 years. It's a business dinner. Sure. Una did not sound convinced in the slightest. Wear something that isn't your interview blazer, is all I'm saying. Camille told herself, walking back to her own desk, that this was nothing. A powerful man taking an unusual interest in unusual competence. Nothing more. She had built a career on being the person who found the number nobody else wanted to look at. The woman who stayed 20 minutes later than everyone else checking her own work twice, because she had learned a long time ago, first in a 2-white prep school on a partial scholarship, and then in rooms exactly like the one she'd just left, that being good was the entry fee, and being undeniable was the only thing that actually kept you in the room. She did not let herself think, not yet, about the particular quality of attention in Baek Do-hyun's eyes when he'd said, "Walk me through it." She filed it away, the way she filed away every uncomfortable, electric thing that happened to her in this city, and went back to work. She did not yet know that across the building, in an office with a view of the Han River and a single-framed photograph of a father he had buried at 26, Baek Do-hyun had not gone back to work at all. He stood at his window for a long time, turning her name over in his mind, and found, to his own quiet alarm, that he did not particularly want to stop. Jung-sik's private room was the kind of quiet that cost money, low light, a single orchid on the table, the city glittering silently through floor-to-ceiling glass. Camille arrived at 7:58, in the navy dress she'd told herself was simply the nicest thing she'd packed, nothing more, and found Do-hyun already seated, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, a posture so unguarded it startled her more than anything he'd said in the boardroom. "You're early," he said, rising briefly as she sat, an old-world courtesy that felt strange coming from a man the internet called a shark in a $3,000 suit. "You strike me as someone who notices when people are late. I notice everything." He said it simply, without arrogance, the way another man might mention he had brown eyes. "It's a useful trait. It's also, according to my mother, the reason I have had 4 executive assistants in 2 years. I heard 3. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "You've already been talking to Una. She's protective. It's sweet. It's accurate. He poured tea for them both without asking. Another small thing she filed away. I'm difficult to work for. I don't pretend otherwise. I expect precision and I don't enjoy explaining myself twice. And yet you invited the analyst who told you, in front of your board, that you were about to lose your company $11 million. I invited the analyst who was right. His eyes met hers, steady, dark, unreadable in the way Yuna had warned her about, except Camille was finding, against every instinct that had kept her safe in rooms like this for 10 years, that she did not want to look away. Tell me something, Miss Adeyemi. In 11 minutes, in a room full of men who outrank you, who could end your secondment with one phone call, you stood up and told me I was wrong. Why? She considered lying, considered the polished, safe answer about due diligence and fiduciary responsibility. She gave him the true one instead. Because somebody had to, and I was the only one in the room who'd actually read the appendix. I didn't do the math on what it would cost me. I just did the math on the deal. That, Diyun said quietly, is the most honest thing anyone in this building has said to me in a year. Dinner stretched longer than business required. They spoke of the Lagos restructuring for perhaps 20 minutes, and then, somehow, without either of them quite steering it there, they spoke of other things. Her mother's restaurant in Atlanta, the one that had taught her to read a balance sheet before she could legally drive, because her mother refused to let anyone, including her own daughter, touch the books without understanding them first. His father, dead 8 years now, a heart that had simply stopped one Tuesday morning at his desk, the funeral Do Hyun had walked through like a man underwater, the company that had landed on his shoulders 3 weeks later, ready or not. He did not usually talk about his father. He realized this somewhere around his second cup of tea and found that he did not particularly want to stop either. You run on grief, Camille said, not unkindly, watching him. I can see it. You run this whole company like if you slow down for 1 second, something else you love will die on you. He went very still. Nobody had said anything like that to him in 8 years. His own mother tiptoed around the subject of his father like it was a sleeping animal that might wake and bite. His board feared him too much to psychoanalyze him over barbecued eel. That's a dangerous thing to say to your chairman, he said finally, voice low. You hired me because I say dangerous true things in rooms where everyone else says safe, comfortable lies. She held his gaze. I'm not going to stop just because we're not in the boardroom anymore. Something in his chest, the thing that had cracked that afternoon, opened a little wider. The car he sent to take her home, unrequested, uninvited, and entirely typical of him, arrived at the curb before she'd even finished her tea. She didn't argue. She'd already learned that arguing with Baek Do-hyun about small kindnesses was like arguing with the tide. The next morning, a coffee appeared on her desk at exactly 8:47 from the small specialty roaster 4 blocks away that she'd mentioned once in passing, 11 days into a 6-month assignment, to a man who apparently forgot nothing. There was no note. There didn't need to be one. Una took one look at the cup, the particular shade of seafoam green only that roaster used, and slowly lowered herself into her chair like her legs had stopped working. He does not do this, Una whispered. Camille, he does not do this. It's just coffee. It is never just coffee with that man. Nothing he does is ever just the thing it looks like. By the end of the week, it had become a quiet, undeniable pattern. Files that should have taken her department 3 days to clear landed on her desk pre-approved within hours. A car waited for her every evening at exactly 6:15, whether she asked for it or not. When a junior associate from strategy, a smooth, handsome man named Young-ho, who had been circling Camille's desk with increasing confidence all week, leaned against her cubicle wall on Friday afternoon and asked, with a grin that suggested he was used to getting yes for an answer, whether she'd like to see Seoul properly, his treat, Do Hyun appeared in the doorway of the bullpen less than 90 seconds later, for no reason anyone could later explain, since he had no actual business on the 38th floor. Jung-ho. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man exercising enormous self-control. My office. Now. Jung-ho went pale and went. Camille watched him go, then looked back to find Do-hyun's eyes already on her, dark and unreadable and, underneath the ice, burning with something he had clearly not given himself permission to feel yet. That wasn't necessary, she said quietly, once the bullpen had gone back to its nervous pretense of working. He has a reprimand on file for harassment complaints from 2 other departments. Do-hyun's jaw was tight. I would have pulled him aside regardless. Would you? He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. They both knew the truth standing in the space between them, electric and unspoken. And for the first time since she'd arrived in this glass and steel tower, Camille Adeyemi found herself wondering, with something dangerously close to hope, whether the coldest man in Seoul might actually be the warmest thing she'd touched in years. 3 weeks passed, and Camille's 6-month secondment began to feel, in private moments she did not examine too closely, less like an assignment and more like a life she was building without meaning to. She told herself it was the city. Seoul had a way of getting under a person's skin. The late-night street food vendors on Yeoljiro. The way mist sat low over the Han River at dawn when she ran along the bike path before work. The particular gold the light turned every evening over Beak International's glass towers. She told herself it was the work, the Lagos deal finally moving the way it should. Her name now attached to a restructuring that would, if it closed clean, be the kind of thing that made careers. She did not let herself say, out loud, even to herself, that it was him. But it was getting harder to pretend otherwise. He had started finding reasons to walk her floor at the end of the day. He had memorized, without ever once writing it down, that she took her coffee black before 9 and with cream after, that she hummed under her breath when she was deep in a model and didn't know anyone could hear her, that she touched the small gold cross at her throat, a gift from her late grandmother, whenever a meeting went badly and she needed something solid to hold on to. He noticed. He always noticed. She was beginning to understand the particular way Baek Do-hyun loved things, not with grand declarations but with the terrifying, exhaustive attention of a man cataloging everything about a person he was afraid to lose before he had even let himself have her. You work too late, he told her one Tuesday, finding her still at her desk past 10, the bullpen otherwise empty, the city outside gone fully dark and glittering. Says the man whose office light I can see from here every night. That's different, it's my company. It's my career. She didn't look up from her screen. Same stakes, different name on the door. He pulled a chair from the empty desk beside hers and sat, close enough that she caught the clean cedar warmth of his cologne, close enough that her pulse did something inconvenient and immediate. Tell me about your mother's restaurant. Why? Because you mentioned it once, 3 weeks ago, and you haven't mentioned it since. And I think that means it matters to you more than almost anything else you've told Maya, and I would like to know it. She looked at him for a long moment. Nobody asked her that. Not really. Not like they meant to actually sit with the answer. It's called Eddie Emmy's, soul food Sunday dinner every day of the week. My mom built it from a card table on Cascade Road when I was 6. I did the books by hand at the kitchen table starting when I was 9 because she couldn't afford a bookkeeper, and she refused to let anybody cheat her blind the way her own father got cheated out of his shop in the 80s. Camille's voice softened, the armor in it dropping a fraction. I learned to read a profit and loss statement before I learned long division. I think some part of me has been trying to prove every single day since that I belong in rooms like this one. That a girl who grew up doing inventory on a folding table can sit at the same table as men who inherited theirs. You belong in this room, Do-hyun said, low and certain, more than anyone else in this building, including me. I inherited mine. You earned yours. It was such a simple thing to say, and it undid her completely. She had to look away, out at the dark glittering city, to keep him from seeing exactly how much those words had cost her composure. Careful, Chairman Beak, she said, when she trusted her voice again. You're starting to sound like a man with feelings. I have been accused of worse. His eyes did not leave her face. I find I do not mind it as much, with you. He did not touch her. He never touched her, in those weeks, beyond the accidental brush of fingers passing a folder, the warmth of his hand at the small of her back guiding her through a crowded gala 2 weeks later, gone before she could decide whether to lean into it or step away. He was, in every visible way, a model of restraint. But restraint, she was learning, was its own kind of confession. A man who wanted nothing did not memorize the way a woman took her coffee. A man who felt nothing did not appear in a doorway 90 seconds after another man made her uncomfortable. The gala came 2 weeks later, a black tie fundraiser for a children's hospital that half of Seoul's business elite attended more for the photographs than the cause. Camille wore deep emerald, because Yuna had insisted, and because some reckless part of her had wanted for one single night to see what would happen if she stopped trying to be invisible in rooms like this one. What happened was that Baek Do-hyun, across a ballroom of 300 people, stopped speaking mid-sentence to his own chief financial officer the moment she walked in, and did not finish the thought. You look, he said, finding her 20 minutes later by the terrace doors, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it, like a problem I do not know how to solve. Is that a compliment, Chairman Baek? It's a confession. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, almost unguarded, almost young, almost like a man who had not buried his father at 26 and built a fortress out of his own grief. I have spent 3 weeks telling myself this is a professional interest. Tonight I am finding that lie considerably harder to maintain. Before she could answer, a woman's voice cut between them, bright and possessive. Do-hyun, I didn't know you'd be attending tonight. A tall woman in red silk, perfectly composed, slid an arm through his with the easy confidence of long familiarity. "Camille's at Minji Park. Dooyeon's family and mine have been close for years. Our fathers had certain understandings." Camille felt something in her chest go cold and careful, the old armor sliding back into place out of pure habit. "Lovely to meet you." Dooyeon extracted his arm from Minjai's with a quiet, practiced ease that suggested this was not a new occurrence. "Minjai, you'll have to excuse us. Miss Adeyemi and I were discussing the Lagos figures." "At a charity gala?" Minjai's smile didn't move, but something sharp flickered behind her eyes as they swept over Camille, assessing, dismissive. "How dedicated of you both." She left, eventually, but the chill she'd brought with her lingered, and Camille found herself, 20 minutes later, alone on the terrace watching the city lights, wondering if she had imagined the entire evening, if a man like Baek Do-yeon could ever actually choose a woman like her over a lifetime of understandings between families like his. He found her there. Of course he found her there. "Minjai's father wants a merger between our companies," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the rail, not touching her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him in the cool night air. "He has wanted it for 6 years. I have told him no for 6 years." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I saw your face when she put her hand on my arm, and I will not have you carrying around a wrong idea about what does and does not matter to me." He turned, finally, to face her fully, and the look in his eyes stripped away every careful professional distance either of them had maintained for 3 weeks. "I have built walls around myself for 8 years, Camille. I did not think anyone would get past them. I did not particularly want anyone to try." His voice dropped lower. "And then you stood up in my boardroom and told me I was wrong, and you have been taking those walls apart, brick by brick, every single day since, without seeming to even notice you were doing it." "Dooyeon, I am not finished." He stepped closer, and the city lights blurred gold and distant behind him. "I do not know how to do this halfway. I have never done anything halfway in my life. If I am wrong about what is happening between us, tell me now, and I will go back inside and I will never raise the subject again, and we will finish the Lagos deal and you will go home to New York in 5 months, and that will be the end of it." The wind off the river was cold. Her heart was not. "And if you're not wrong?" Something in his face broke open, raw and unguarded and almost frightening in its honesty. "Then I am not going to let a 6-month secondment decide how this ends." She did not move away when he finally closed the last small distance between them. She did not move away at all. The week that followed the gala was, in its own quiet way, the most ordinary week of Camille's secondment, and that ordinariness felt, after months of careful distance, like the most extraordinary thing of all. Dooyeon took her to a noodle stand near Gwangjang Market on a Wednesday night, a tiny, steam-fogged stall with 3 plastic stools and no sign, the kind of place no business profile would ever associate with the chairman of Baek International. He ate standing up, sleeves rolled, laughing, actually laughing, when Camille discovered she could not handle the spice level he ordered without flinching, and tried, with great dignity, to pretend otherwise. "You don't have to perform composure with me," he said, sliding his water glass across to her, eyes warm with an amusement she had rarely seen directed at anything, let alone at her own watering eyes and reddened face. "I have already seen you correct a board of directors. I am not going anywhere because spicy tteokbokki defeated you." "I am not defeated. I am building tolerance. You are crying. It's character development." He laughed again, low and unguarded, and reached over to brush a strand of hair from her damp forehead with a tenderness that had nothing to do with boardrooms or deals, or any of the careful architecture either of them had built their lives around. At that moment, surrounded by steam and strangers and the particular chaos of a market at night, Camille understood with sudden clarity that she was not simply attracted to Baek Do-yeon. She was falling, slowly and completely, for the man underneath the chairman, the one who ate street food standing up and laughed at his own jokes and noticed, always noticed, the smallest true things about the people he let himself care about. It was not all easy, even in that gentler week. 2 nights later, working late over the Lagos appendices in his office instead of the empty bullpen, she found herself watching him across his desk, his focus total, his tie loosened, and felt the old fear surface again, quieter now but not gone. "What happens to me?" she asked before she could talk herself out of it. "If this doesn't work? Professionally, I mean. If we try this and it falls apart, I'm still the analyst who dated the chairman. You stay the chairman. I become a cautionary tale at every dinner party in this industry." He set down his pen, considered the question with the same seriousness he gave a 9-figure acquisition. "Then I will write to you the strongest reference of my professional life, personally call every managing director I know in New York, and spend whatever capital I have left making certain the only story anyone tells about you is the one where you found an $11 million error in 11 minutes. His eyes held hers, steady. "I am not going to pretend there's no risk, Camille. but I refuse to let fear of an ending decide whether we get a beginning. You taught me that, the night you told me you were tired of being careful. I am simply trying to keep up. It was not a perfect answer. It was an honest one, and by then, she had learned that honesty was the only currency that mattered between them. That should have been the beginning of something easy. It was not, because nothing involving the Lagos restructuring had been easy from the start, and the world has a way of testing the things it senses are about to become precious. 10 days after the gala, Do-yeon asked Camille to accompany him to Busan to inspect the shipping terminal at the center of the deal before the final signatures went down. It was meant to be a single overnight trip, 2 site visits, and a dinner with the port authority, back in Seoul by Thursday evening. Neither of them anticipated the typhoon. It came up the coast faster than the forecasts had predicted, the kind of storm meteorologists call unprecedented, and locals along the southern coast call Tuesday. By the time their final meeting wrapped, the airport had already grounded flights, the trains had stopped, and the rented car service informed them, with deep apology, that the roads back toward their hotel were beginning to flood. They made it to the hotel soaked through, laughing despite themselves at the absurdity of 2 of Seoul's most controlled people running through ankle-deep water in business clothes, and found upon checking in that the storm had knocked out power to half the building. "One room is still operational," the front desk clerk told them apologetically. "The generator only covers a portion of the building. I am very sorry. I can arrange a cot." "We'll manage," Do-yeon said, before Camille could even process the sentence, and something in the way he said it, careful, deliberate, faintly nervous in a way she had never once heard from him, told her this was not the inconvenience it appeared to be on the surface. The room was small, warm with candlelight the hotel staff had distributed, rain hammering sideways against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass in its frame. Camille sat on the edge of the single bed, wrapped in a robe the hotel had provided while her clothes dried over the radiator, and watched Do-yeon pace by the window, jacket long gone, sleeves rolled, hair damp and falling loose across his forehead in a way that made him look, for the first time since she'd met him, less like Korea's most feared executive and entirely like a man. "You're worried," she said. "There's a flood warning for the lower district. My father's first shipping yard is down there. It's not operational anymore, hasn't been in years, but..." He stopped pacing, raked a hand through his hair, exhaled. "It's the last building he personally built. I should not care this much about an empty warehouse." "You can care about an empty warehouse and run a multinational company at the same time. Those things aren't in competition. Everything in my life has felt like competition since I was 26. He turned to look at her, candlelight throwing soft gold across the planes of his face, the careful armor he wore every day in boardrooms entirely absent now. Grief or the company, feeling something or surviving the week. "I do not know how to want something, Camille, without being afraid it will be taken from me the way everything else was." The storm howled outside. Inside, the room had gone very quiet, very warm, very small. "I'm not your father's warehouse," Camille said softly, rising from the bed, crossing the small distance between them. "I'm not something you're going to lose by caring about it. You don't know that. Neither do you. Nobody does. That's what makes it worth doing anyway." She reached up, brushed a damp piece of hair back from his forehead, the first time she had ever truly touched him, and felt him go utterly still beneath her hand, like a man holding his breath against the possibility of something good actually happening to him. "I have spent 10 years being careful, Do-yeon. Careful with my career, careful with my heart, careful never to want anything I couldn't lose without it breaking me. I am so tired of being careful. Kemi." Her name in his mouth sounded like something being held very gently. "If I do this, I am not going to be able to undo it. I need you to understand that. I do not know how to love anything halfway. I'm not asking you to." He kissed her then, finally, after weeks of careful distance and electric almost moments, slow and certain and absolutely nothing like the cold, controlled man the business pages described. The candlelight guttered low. The storm wrapped the small room in its own private world, cut off from Seoul, from the board, from Min Jae Park's understanding fathers and 3,000 employees and every careful wall either of them had built to survive the lives they'd been handed. What passed between them after that was not told in detail, only felt the quiet hush of rain against glass, the warmth of finally being known completely by someone who had spent 3 weeks learning every small true thing about you, the particular vulnerability of 2 careful people finally choosing, for one night, not to be careful at all. By morning, the storm had passed, the power had returned, and sunlight broke gold and clean across a city washed by the rain. Camille woke first, in the unfamiliar softness of his arms, and lay very still for a long moment, listening to him breathe, feeling something in her chest that was equal parts terror and a happiness so large it frightened her more than the storm had. She thought of her mother, alone for 20 years since Camille's father had walked out on a family that loved him too much to ever be enough, and she thought, with sudden sharp panic, Of every story she had ever heard about powerful men and the women they discarded once the conquest had been made. 3 assistants in 2 years. A reputation that ran cold the moment something stopped being useful. What if last night had been the storm talking, the vulnerability, the candlelight, and not the man at all? She slipped out from under his arm before he woke, dressed quietly in her still damp clothes, and left the room before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, leaving behind only a note that said, simply, "I have an early call with New York. I'll see you back in Seoul." It was, she would later admit to herself on the long, silent train ride home, the most cowardly thing she had done in 10 years. Do-yeon woke to an empty bed and a note that read like a door closing, and he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had lost things before, exactly what was happening even before he called her 3 times and got her voicemail all 3 times. He did not chase her that morning. He told himself it was strategy, give her room, let her find her way back on her own terms, but the truth, which he admitted to no one, not even himself until much later, was that some old frightened part of him heard her silence and thought, of course she left. Everyone eventually does. Camille, for her part, buried herself in work the moment she returned to Seoul, the way she had buried herself in work her entire adult life whenever feeling something became more dangerous than not feeling it at all. She requested, through proper channels, an acceleration of the New York transfer originally scheduled for the end of her secondment. She told Una it was about career timing. Una, who had watched the entire arc of this thing unfold from 3 desks away, did not believe her for a single second. "You're running," Una said flatly, cornering her in the break room 4 days after Busan, Do-yeon's office door visible and closed down the hall, a closed door that had not opened, Una had noted, in almost the same 4 days. "I have known you for 11 weeks and I already know you run when something matters too much to risk losing it." "I'm not running. I'm being practical. He's the chairman. I'm a secondment analyst. There's an entire universe of reasons this doesn't work long-term and I'd rather end it clean than end it ugly." Did he say one single thing to suggest he wanted to end it? Camille's silence was its own answer. What neither woman knew, in that moment, standing in a break room arguing about a heart neither of them could fully see the shape of yet, was that 4 floors above them, in a glass office with a view of a river that had nearly flooded a warehouse that mattered more than it should have, Vice Chairman Min Sok-won was having a considerably more dangerous conversation. Sok-won was Do-yeon's cousin on his late father's side, 11 years older, passed over for the chairmanship 8 years ago in favor of a 26-year-old in mourning clothes, a decision the board had made out of bloodline loyalty, and one the family had never quite let him forget he resented. For 8 years he had played the loyal vice chairman, patient, deferential, waiting. What the board did not know, what even Do-yeon did not yet suspect, was that Seok-won had spent 3 of those years quietly siphoning Beek International's logistics contracts through a shell network in Busan, covering a gambling debt that had grown over time into something closer to a hole he could no longer climb out of without either confessing or burying it permanently under a much larger transaction. The Lagos acquisition, the very deal Camille had caught Han fumbling 6 weeks ago, was supposed to be his exit. Buried in the original flawed numbers, the ones Camille had corrected, had been a routing clause that would have funneled nearly $9 million through exactly the kind of shell structure Sok-won had spent 3 years building. Her correction in that boardroom had not just saved the company $11 million. It had, without either of them knowing it yet, closed the only clean door Sok-won had left. "The American is a problem," Seok-won said quietly, into a phone in a stairwell where the building's cameras did not reach, a habit of 8 careful years. She caught the routing error before it cleared. "If she stays attached to this deal, if she keeps Do-yeon's attention on the appendix instead of the headline numbers, I lose my window." The voice on the other end, a man whose name appeared on no Beek International payroll, said something low and clipped. "No," Sok-won said. "Not yet. Let me see if Do-yeon handles his own distraction first. If he doesn't, I will handle it for him." He hung up, smoothed his jacket, and walked back into the boardroom wearing the same patient, deferential smile he had worn for 8 years, and nobody in that glass building, not Do-yeon pacing his office 4 days into a silence he didn't know how to break, not Camille filing transfer paperwork with hands that would not quite stay steady, had any idea that the storm that had brought them together in Busan was about to look like very small weather indeed. It was Do-yeon who broke first, in the end, because a man who had spent 8 years learning to survive grief by refusing to feel anything had discovered, in one storm-soaked night in Busan, that he did not actually want to go back to surviving. He found her on a Friday evening, alone in the bullpen again, the transfer paperwork open on her screen, and he did not knock, did not wait to be invited, simply crossed the empty floor and stopped at the edge of her desk like a man who had run out of patience for careful distance. "You're transferring back to New York. Early. It's a good career move." "It's a lie, and you are the worst liar I have met in 8 years of reading liars for a living." His voice was rough, stripped of every boardroom polish she had ever heard in it. "You left a note instead of a goodbye, Camille. You have not returned 3 calls. And now I find paperwork on your desk to put an ocean between us before either of us has said a single honest word about what happened in that hotel room." "What do you want me to say, Do-hyun?" Her composure cracked finally, 4 days of careful armor giving way all at once. "That I'm terrified? I have watched it my whole life. What happens to women who hand themselves over to powerful men who eventually decide the cost of keeping them isn't worth it? My father did it to my mother. Min Jae-park looked at me at that gala like I was a stain on her evening. You have had 3 assistants quit in 2 years because loving you, even just working for you, apparently costs more than most people can pay. I corrected your numbers in a boardroom and I have spent every day since terrified that the moment I stop being useful or interesting or new, you'll look at me the exact same way." The silence that followed held the whole weight of the city outside the windows. "Kemi." Do-hyun came around the desk, knelt, in a way the man on the cover of Forbes Korea had never once been photographed doing for anyone, until they were eye level, until there was nowhere left for either of them to hide. "I do not know how to convince you of something with words, because I have spent 8 years using words as armor instead of truth. So let me try the truth instead. I have not been able to sit in that boardroom since Busan without seeing the chair you sat on the day you corrected May. I have not had dinner anywhere in this city without comparing it to that table at Jungsik. I called my own mother 2 days ago, for the first time in 4 months, and told her I think I am in love with a woman who is about to fly 11,000 miles away from May, and do you know what she said?" Camille shook her head, throat too tight for words. She said, finally. "She said your father waited too long to choose anything over this company, and look what it cost him. Do not make the same mistake, Do-hyuna." His voice broke, just slightly, on the old childhood form of his name, a vulnerability she had never once heard from him. "I am not your father, Camille. I am not Min Jae's understanding of families or every powerful man who ever decided a woman was disposable once she stopped being convenient. I do not know how to prove that to you except by staying, every single day, for as long as you will let me." She was crying, she realized distantly, the careful armor she had built over 10 years finally, fully, undone by a man kneeling on an office floor at 7 o'clock on a Friday evening. "Withdraw the transfer," he said quietly, taking her hands in his. "Stay. Not because I am your chairman and not because the deal needs you. Stay because I am asking you to, as a man, for the first time in my life, to choose something over the company that has owned every other part of me since I was 26. If I stay," she whispered, "and this falls apart anyway, it's going to break something in me I'm not sure I can fix. Then we will not let it fall apart." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, gentle, certain. "I told you in Busan, I do not know how to do this halfway." She withdrew the transfer paperwork the following Monday morning, deleted before it ever reached HR. Neither of them, in that quiet, hopeful moment, had any idea how soon and how violently the world was about to test exactly how far halfway measures stretched. The weeks that followed were, by any honest accounting, the happiest either of them had been in years. It was not announced publicly. Not yet, Do-hyun was careful about that, protective of her position within the company, unwilling to let the board's gossip turn her competence into a punchline about the chairman's girlfriend. But within the building, the change was impossible to miss. He smiled more, actual smiles, not the careful diplomatic curve he gave investors. He took lunch most days instead of working through it. Una swore she heard him laugh in a hallway, an event so unprecedented that 3 separate employees independently reported it to HR as a possible medical emergency. Camille, in turn, found herself, for the first time in a decade of careful self-protection, simply happy without immediately calculating the cost of it. She still worked late, still checked her models twice, still touched the small gold cross at her throat in difficult meetings, but the touch had changed its meaning. Less a search for solid ground and more a small, grateful habit, because she had found, unexpectedly, 11,000 miles from home, something solid enough to hold onto that wasn't only inside herself. The Lagos deal moved toward final signature. 6 weeks of careful renegotiation, much of it led personally by Camille, had repaired the margin Han's original error would have destroyed, and the closing date was set for the 2nd week of November, a date that would, not coincidentally, fall 3 days before Camille's original secondment was due to end, a deadline neither of them spoke about directly, but both of them privately understood needed an answer. Min Seok-won understood the closing date better than either of them. He had spent 6 weeks watching his window collapse in real time, watching Camille's corrections strip out every routing clause he had buried in the original numbers, watching his cousin fall, against every prediction Seok-won had made about the boy's frozen, careful heart, completely and visibly in love with the one person standing between him and $9 million he could not survive without. The gambling debt had not gotten smaller while he waited. It had gotten teeth. He moved 3 days before the closing. It began small. The kind of small that looked, on the surface, like ordinary corporate sabotage rather than the opening move of something far more dangerous. A routing error appeared in the final shipping manifest, traced, after 2 days of furious investigation, back to a server access log under Camille's credentials. Credentials Seok had quietly cloned using access any vice chairman could justify on paper. By the time IT confirmed the breach wasn't hers, the board had already spent a tense, ugly morning meeting discussing whether the American analyst could be trusted with a deal this size, whether her relationship with the chairman had compromised the company's judgment, whether this entire restructuring needed an independent review before signature. Do-Hyun shut the meeting down with a coldness that frightened even the board members who had known him for years. Anyone who repeats the suggestion that Miss Adeyemi compromised this deal will be removed from this board, he said, voice flat and final. She found the error that would have cost us $11 million. She did not create the one that appeared 3 days before closing. Find out who did it. Camille heard about the meeting secondhand, from Una, and did not wait for Do-Hyun to fight the battle alone. She requested, and was granted, 10 minutes in front of the same board the following morning, walking them line by line through her own audit trail, the timestamps that placed her physically in a strategy session 2 floors away at the exact moment her credentials had supposedly been used. The simple, damning fact that whoever had cloned her access had not bothered to clone her actual habits, since the real Camille never touched a manifest without first cross-checking it against 3 separate ledgers, a discipline the cloned login had skipped entirely. I would like the record to reflect, she said, closing her tablet, meeting each board member's eyes in turn the way she had the very first day, that I did not earn a seat at this table by being convenient. I earned it by being right, even when being right was inconvenient for someone. I intend to keep doing exactly that, regardless of who it inconveniences next. It was not lost on anyone in that room, least of all Do-Hyun, watching from the head of the table with quiet, fierce pride, that the woman defending herself against sabotage was the very same woman who had once, calmly, dismantled a flawed deal in front of these exact same men. Seok, seated 3 chairs down, expressed appropriate concern, and felt, underneath his composed face, the particular calm of a man watching his contingency plan begin to work exactly as designed. The contingency plan's second phase arrived the following evening. Camille was working late again, alone in the bullpen, the building mostly emptied out, when her phone rang from an unknown Seoul number. A woman's voice, professional, slightly accented, informed her that Do-Hyun had been in a car accident near the Han River Bridge, that he was asking for her, that a car was already downstairs to bring her to the hospital. She did not think. She never thought, when it came to him anymore, that particular careful calculation she had spent 10 years perfecting simply did not exist when his safety was the variable in the equation. She grabbed her coat and her bag and ran for the elevator, and she was 3 blocks from the building, in the back of an unfamiliar black car driven by a man who did not speak when she asked which hospital, before the cold, sick understanding finally arrived. This isn't the way to Severance Hospital. The driver did not answer. The doors, she realized, testing the handle with rising panic, had been locked from a control she could not reach. Outside the tinted windows, the familiar glittering skyline of Gangnam slid past and then fell away, replaced by the darker, quieter industrial roads toward the river. Her phone, when she finally got her shaking hands to pull it from her bag, had no signal at all. She made herself breathe, the way she had trained herself to breathe through 10 years of boardrooms that wanted to see her panic. Fear was data, her mother had always told her, across that same kitchen table where she'd learned to read a balance sheet. Useful only if you let it sharpen you instead of freeze you. She watched the road signs through the tinted glass, memorizing what she could. A route number, the name of a fish market they passed twice in a wide, looping circle clearly meant to disorient her. When the car finally stopped at the warehouse and a silent man walked her inside, zip-tying her hands loosely enough that she understood, with cold clarity, this was meant to look clean rather than cruel, a controlled inconvenience rather than violence, she catalogued every exit, every gap in the corrugated walls, every weakness in the single board guard's attention, the same exacting, patient way she once catalogued a flawed currency model. She did not waste her composure on tears that would not help her. She saved it for later, for the warehouse floor, for a man she trusted completely to come looking the second he understood she was gone, because she had learned, in the months since a typhoon trapped them together in Busan, that hope built on evidence was not naivety. It was simply good math. Do-Hyun was not, in fact, in any car accident. He was in his office, finishing a call with the Lagos Port Authority, when his phone buzzed with a security alert he almost ignored. An unauthorized vehicle had logged Camille's badge exit at 8:52 p.m., flagged because her badge had also, somehow, simultaneously scanned at her desk floor's turnstile 4 minutes later, a duplication error the system had never once thrown in 3 years of operation. He called her. No answer. He called again. Straight to voicemail, the kind of immediate, total silence that meant a phone had been powered off, not simply unanswered. The cold, careful man the business pages had spent 8 years describing did not exist in the next 90 seconds. What replaced him was something older and far more dangerous. The particular fury of a man who had already lost one person he loved to circumstances beyond his control, and had sworn, somewhere in the wreckage of his father's funeral, that he would burn the world down before he let it happen twice. "Pull every camera between this building and the river," he said to his head of security, already moving, already calling his driver, voice gone flat and lethal in a way none of his staff had ever heard from him. "Pull her phone's last location. Pull the badge logs. I want to know who authorized a vehicle under her name in the next 4 minutes, or I will personally end the career of everyone in this building who fails to find it." It took 11 minutes, 11 of the longest minutes of Do-hyun's life. Standing in the building's security office watching grainy footage of Camille climbing into a black sedan with a license plate that came back. When finally run, registered to a logistics shell company buried 4 layers deep in a corporate structure Do-hyun recognized, with a sick lurch of betrayal, as one his own cousin had quietly built. He found Saekwon in the executive parking garage, calmly loading a single briefcase into his own car, a flight to Macau already booked for 6 the following morning, a man in the final, careful stages of disappearing. "Where is she?" Do-hyun's voice did not rise. It had gone past rising into something far colder. Saekwon did not bother pretending to be confused, not anymore, not with his cousin's eyes on him like that. There was almost relief in his face, the relief of a man finally putting down a weight he'd carried for 3 exhausting years. "The Incheon warehouse. The old one, by the disused dock. She's unharmed, Do-hyun. I am not a monster. I needed her out of the building long enough for the closing signatures to go through with the routing clause restored, and I needed you distracted enough not to notice until it was done. You used my father's company to bury a gambling debt." Do-hyun's hands had curled into fists. "You put your hands on the one person in 8 years who has made me feel like more than the company that swallowed my whole life, and you are telling me you are not a monster. I am a desperate man, cousin, which, in my experience, is worse." Saekwon's composure finally cracked, just slightly, 8 years of careful resentment spilling out all at once. "You were handed this company at 26 because of blood you did not earn any more than I failed to earn it. I have spent 8 years watching you build something I was passed over for, and when I finally found a way out from under a debt that was going to end with my own family finding me in a river, you let an American analyst undo it in 11 minutes in a boardroom. You could have come to May." Something in Do-hyun's voice cracked, underneath the fury, the old grief of a fractured family surfacing even now. "Whatever the debt was, whatever shame you thought it would cost you, we buried my father together, Saekwon. I would have found a way to help you that did not involve a warehouse and a woman who has never done a single thing to you except be better at her job than the men around her. Would you have?" Saekwon's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Or would you have looked at me the way the board looked at me for 8 years, polite, patient, and already certain I was lesser? I did not want your charity, Do-hyun. I wanted what should have been mine." "What should have been yours," Do-hyun said quietly, "was never this company. It was honesty, with me, 3 years ago, before a debt became a kidnapping. That door is closed now. You closed it yourself, the moment you put her in that car. Where is she?" Something in Do-hyun's face in that moment made even a desperate man take a careful step back. Saekwon told him. The drive to Incheon took 31 minutes, which felt like 31 years. Do-hyun called the police the moment he had the address, then called them again with his own legal team on the line when the local precinct's response felt too slow for the particular fury moving through his blood, and arrived at the disused dockside warehouse 4 minutes before the first patrol car, because no force on earth, official or otherwise, was going to arrive at that building before he did. The warehouse, when he reached it, sat dark and silent against the black water of the inlet, one weak floodlight swinging on a loose cable above the loading dock, the only sign that anything inside was occupied at all. Do-hyun left his car running in the gravel lot, did not wait for backup, did not wait for the patrol cars he could already hear, faint and far off, threading through the industrial streets behind him. He went in through a rusted side door that gave way on the second strike of his shoulder, every careful, controlled instinct that had governed his life for 8 years burned away by something far more primal. The interior was a maze of stacked containers and broken machinery, shadows pooling thick between rows of crates that had not moved in years. He moved through it fast and silent, the way he had once moved through grief, methodically, refusing to stop until he had accounted for everything, until he found, at the far end of the building near a bank of grimy windows, a single weak lamp burning over an overturned crate, and the woman he loved sitting beneath it, alive. Inside, Camille sat on an overturned crate in a cold, mostly empty warehouse, hands zip-tied loosely in front of her, more frightened than hurt, watched over by a single board guard who had clearly been told this would be simple and quiet, and was now facing the considerably less simple reality of Baek Do-hyun coming through the warehouse's side door like something unleashed. The guard reached for something at his belt. He never got the chance to use it. Do-hyun closed the distance between them in 3 strides and put him on the concrete floor with a single, brutal economy of motion that belonged to a man who had spent 8 years channeling every unbearable feeling into discipline, finally, for one necessary moment, letting that discipline become something else entirely. The guard did not put up much of a fight after that. Few men would, against a man with that particular look in his eyes. Camille. Do-hyun crossed the warehouse floor in seconds, dropping to his knees in front of the crate, hands shaking, for the first time in 8 years of careful control, as he worked the zip ties loose. Camille, look at me. Are you hurt? Tell me you're not hurt. I'm okay. Her voice shook, but her eyes, when they found his, held steady underneath the fear, the particular steadiness of a woman who read currency hedges to a room full of powerful men without flinching. I'm okay, Do-hyun. I knew you'd come. I will always come. He pulled her against his chest the moment her hands were free, holding her like a man who had nearly lost the only thing that had made the last 8 years bearable, his voice breaking completely for the first time since she'd known him. Do you understand that? There is no version of my life, no deal, no company, no inheritance where I do not come for you. I told you in Busan I do not know how to do this halfway. I meant it. I will burn every contract my father ever signed before I let anything happen to you. Outside, sirens finally arrived, red and blue light sweeping across the warehouse's broken windows. Camille held on to him in the cold, in the dark, in the wreckage of a plan 8 years in the making, and felt, underneath the fear still flooding her system, something that felt almost like certainty. Your cousin, she said quietly, against his chest. He's not going to just disappear quietly, is he? No. Do-hyun's arms tightened around her. His voice went hard again. The fury banked, but not gone. And he is not going to get the chance to try. He did not let the paramedics simply check her and release her, did not let the police take her statement until a doctor had confirmed, twice, that the worst of it was fear and a few bruises and not anything more lasting. He sat beside her hospital bed through the small hours of the morning, refusing every offer to rest, holding her hand while she finally let herself cry the way she had not allowed herself to in the warehouse itself, where staying steady had felt like the only thing keeping either of them alive. I knew you'd find me, she said again, somewhere around 4 a.m, her voice thick with exhaustion. The whole time, even when I was scared, some part of me just knew. How? His voice was raw, his own composure finally, fully spent. How did you know that, Camille? I have spent 8 years being a man nobody could fully count on for anything except numbers and silence. Because you memorized how I take my coffee 3 weeks after meeting me, she said, eyes closing, exhaustion finally pulling her toward sleep. A man who pays that much attention does not stop paying attention the one time it matters most. He called Patrice himself, before sunrise, before Camille woke again, because he understood, even exhausted and raw, that a mother 3,000 miles away deserved to hear her daughter was safe from someone other than a frightened text message. Patrice cried on the phone for a full minute before she could speak, and then, in a voice that had clearly faced down worse than this, told him simply, "Take care of my girl," and he promised her, with every certainty left in him, that he would, for as long as either of them had breath to manage it. Min Seok-won did not make his flight to Macau. He was arrested at the warehouse before he ever reached the airport, his careful 8-year contingency collapsing in the space of a single night, and the following Monday, Beek International's board convened for the second emergency session in the company's history, the first having been called the week Do-hyun's father died. Camille had not planned to attend. She sat at her desk that morning, 3 stitches above her left eyebrow from a fall she'd taken climbing out of the sedan the night before, watching the clock count down to the meeting and trying to decide whether showing her face in that boardroom would help Do-hyun's position, or complicate it. The decision was made for her at 9:47, when his assistant appeared at her desk with a single message. He's asking for you. 3rd chair, same as before, if you're willing. She walked into the same boardroom where, 10 weeks earlier, she had corrected a vice president's currency assumptions and changed the entire shape of her life, and found every seat full, every eye on her, and Do-hyun standing at the head of the table, not seated, standing, the posture of a man who had something to say and intended every person in that room to hear it standing up. 3 days ago, he began, voice carrying clean and steady across the silent room, Vice Chairman Min Seok-won orchestrated the abduction of a member of this company's staff to cover the discovery of nearly $9 million in embezzled logistics contracts. Contracts he had been routing through a shell network for 3 years, contracts this board would never have found without the work of the woman he had kidnapped to silence. A murmur moved through the room. Several board members would not meet his eyes. I want to be transparent with this board about something else, as well, since we are clearly done pretending discretion matters more than honesty in this building. Do-hyun's gaze found Camille, standing quietly near the door, and did not look away. 10 weeks ago, Camille Adeyemi stood in this room and told me I was wrong, in front of all of you, at considerable professional risk to herself, because the truth mattered more to her than her own comfort. I have not, since that day, found a single moment where I did not want her exactly that close to every decision this company makes. I am telling you this not as a confession, but as a fact you are entitled to know before any of you decide to question her judgment, her competence, or her place in this building ever again. He crossed the room, in front of the entire board, in front of his father's portrait on the wall, and took her hand. Camille Adeyemi saved this company $11 million in a single boardroom meeting. She rebuilt a 6-week deal under sabotage I did not even know was happening around us. And 3 nights ago, sitting zip-tied in a cold warehouse, frightened and alone, she still had the presence of mind to tell me she knew I would come for her. His voice roughened, the boardroom polish falling away entirely, leaving only the truth underneath it. I would like this board to formally know, before the Lagos closing proceeds to signature this afternoon, that I intend to marry this woman, and that any future decision regarding her position, her competence, or her place in this company should be made with that fact fully understood. The silence that followed was, this time, not the silence of shock at being corrected. It was something closer to wonder, 11 board members watching the coldest, most controlled chairman in Korean shipping stand in the middle of his own boardroom holding a woman's hand like it was the only solid thing left in his world, and finding, to their own quiet surprise, that they believed every word of it. Well, the eldest board member, a man who had served under Do-hyun's father for 20 years, finally broke the silence with something that might almost have been a smile. I suppose we should proceed to signature then, before the chairman finds something even more dramatic to announce. Laughter, real and relieved, moved through the room, and Camille, standing in the middle of it with her hand still held tight in Do-hyun's, felt the last of the fear from 3 nights ago finally, fully release its grip on her chest. The Lagos restructuring closed that afternoon at 4:12 p.m., every margin intact, every routing clause clean, the deal that had nearly destroyed the company and nearly cost Camille her life finally, officially, complete. Min Seok-won's case moved to prosecutors within the week, the embezzlement charges thorough enough that even his family's old loyalty could not soften the board's unanimous vote to remove him permanently from every position he had ever held within the company. Han, chastened and genuinely repentant after weeks of watching Camille's quiet competence reshape every assumption he'd carelessly made, requested, of all things, to be assigned to her team going forward, a request Do-hyun approved with something close to amusement. Minji Park sent a single, brief note of congratulations 2 weeks later that surprised everyone, including herself, by being entirely sincere. "You were right," she wrote, that night at the gala. "I could see it even then. I am glad he finally let someone all the way in." He did not propose right away, despite what he'd announced to an entire boardroom. He told her, the night of the closing, holding her on the balcony of his apartment overlooking a city that had nearly cost them everything, that he refused to let a proposal be born out of crisis and adrenaline, that she deserved a question asked in peace, not in the aftermath of fear. "You already told the entire board you intend to marry May," she pointed out, laughing despite herself, her head on his shoulder, the city lights soft and gold below them. "I told the board a fact about my own intentions. I have not yet asked you the actual question." He pressed a kiss to her temple, his arms tightening around her. "I am old-fashioned in exactly one part of my life, Camille. I would like to do this part properly." He did it 6 weeks later, in Atlanta, of all places, because some part of him understood, with the same careful attention he had given every other detail about her since the day she corrected him in that boardroom, that the question would not mean what it needed to mean unless it was asked in the city that had built her, at the restaurant her mother had grown from a card table on Cascade Road. Camille's mother, a sharp, warm, formidable woman named Patrice, who had spent 30 years reading people across a dinner counter and had decided, within 11 minutes of meeting Baek Do-hyun, that this particular powerful man was not like the one who had walked out on her own life, watched from behind the counter with tears already gathering as Do-hyun knelt, in the middle of a Sunday dinner rush, beside the corner table where a 9-year-old Camille had once done bookkeeping by hand. "I have spent 8 years building a company my father left me," Do-hyun said, ring box open, voice steady despite the room full of strangers who had all, without quite meaning to, gone silent to watch. "I have spent the last 3 months learning what it feels like to actually want something more than I want to survive my own grief. You taught me that, Camille. You stood in my boardroom and told me I was wrong, and then you spent every day teaching me how to be right about the things that actually matter." His voice caught, just slightly. "I do not know how to do this halfway. I never have. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that I am nothing like the men who taught you to be careful." Camille, crying for the second time in front of her mother's entire restaurant in 3 months, did not make him wait for the answer. The wedding took place the following spring, on a clear April afternoon when the cherry blossoms along the Han River had just begun to let go, drifting pink and weightless past the windows of the small chapel Camille's mother had insisted on flying in to help decorate herself. refusing, with the same stubborn pride that had built a restaurant from a card table, to let a single flower arrangement be hired out to strangers. It was a small, fierce, joyful blending of two worlds that had never been meant to touch. Patrice's soul food laid out alongside a traditional Korean pie-beak ceremony in the reception hall afterward, the smell of fried chicken and jujube dates and warm rice cake mingling in a way that should not have worked and somehow, perfectly, did. Camille walked down the aisle in a dress that had taken her mother 3 fittings and 1 entire box of tissues to approve, holding a small bouquet of white peonies, and found Do Hyun waiting for her at the end of it in a dark suit. His composure, for once, entirely abandoned, eyes wet before she'd even reached him. Una stood as a bridesmaid in emerald, the same shade Camille had worn the night of the gala, a detail Una had insisted on with a knowing grin that made Camille laugh through her own nerves. The eldest board member, the one who had finally smiled in that long-ago boardroom, gave a toast that brought half the room to tears, recalling, with surprising warmth, the day a young analyst had stood up to a chairman nobody else dared question, and changed the whole shape of the company's future in 11 honest minutes. Do Hyun wore his father's cufflinks. Small, plain, gold, the one possession of the man he had kept close through 8 years of grief disguised as discipline. Camille wore her grandmother's small gold cross at her throat, the one she had touched so many times for courage in boardrooms and warehouses, and every careful, frightened moment in between, worn now, finally, simply for joy. There was no shadow of Min Seok-won anywhere in that room. No shadow of Min Jae's understanding fathers, no shadow of every careful wall either of them had spent years building to survive lives that had asked too much of them too soon. There was only candlelight and cherry blossoms and the particular, hard-won lightness of 2 people who had finally stopped being careful, standing in front of everyone who loved them, choosing each other completely, while a string quartet played something soft and golden, and the last of the afternoon light fell warm across the room like a held breath, finally released. His mother had needed more convincing than Patrice, though not for the reasons Camille had feared. Mrs. Beek was not opposed to an American daughter-in-law, not opposed even to a black daughter-in-law, despite the quiet, predictable murmurs that had moved through certain corners of Seoul's business circles once the engagement became public. What worried her, when Do Hyun brought Camille to the family home 2 weeks before the wedding, tea trembling slightly in her hands as she studied the woman her son intended to marry, was something far more personal. "My husband loved this company the way some men love a religion," she said quietly, in careful English, watching Camille across the low table with eyes that missed nothing. "It took most of him before it took the rest. I watched my son become the same man, cold, careful, married to grief instead of to anything that could love him back. I need to know you are marrying my son, not the chairman of Beek International, because if you are marrying the chairman, I promise you, the company will eventually win, the way it won against his father, the way it nearly won against him." Camille set down her own tea, met the older woman's gaze without flinching, the same steadiness she had once carried into a boardroom full of men who outranked her. "Mrs. Beek, I corrected your son in front of his entire board the day I met him, because I did not yet know who he was and I only cared about the truth and the numbers. I fell in love with him 3 weeks later, in the middle of a typhoon, when he told me he was more frightened of an empty warehouse than he was of losing the company that built it, because that warehouse was the last thing his father ever touched with his own 2 hands. Her voice softened, sure and warm. "I am not marrying the chairman of Beek International. I am marrying the man who knelt on an office floor and told me he didn't know how to want something without being afraid of losing it. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure he never has to be afraid of that again." Mrs. Beek was quiet for a long moment, studying her future daughter-in-law with an expression that slowly, carefully, softened into something like relief. "My husband would have liked you," she said finally. "He did not like very many people. He would have liked you very much." She reached across the table and took Camille's hand, the first deliberately warm gesture she had offered all afternoon. "Take care of my son. He has spent 8 years taking care of everyone else." "I intend to," Camille said, and meant it completely. Married life, once the wedding settled into ordinary days, found its own rhythm faster than either of them expected. Camille kept her position at Beek International, promoted within the year to head strategic finance, a title she had earned 3 times over before anyone made it official, and Do Hyun discovered, to his own quiet delight, that working alongside the person who understood him most completely made the company feel, for the first time in 8 years, less like a weight he carried alone and more like something they were building together. He still worked too late, some nights. She still touched her grandmother's cross in difficult meetings, though the habit had softened from anxious to simply familiar. They argued, occasionally, the way any 2 strong-willed, fiercely competent people will argue, about strategy, about boundaries, about the particular stubbornness each of them had spent a lifetime perfecting. But the jealousy and fear that had shadowed their early weeks together, Minji's understanding fathers, Camille's old terror of being discarded once she stopped being new, slowly, steadily, gave way to something far more durable, the quiet, unglamorous trust of two people who had already proven, under the worst possible circumstances, that they would come for each other every single time. Una, promoted alongside Camille and still fiercely protective of the friendship that had started it all, liked to remind anyone who would listen that she had called it the very first week, watching a seafoam green coffee cup appear on a desk with no note attached. "I told you," she'd say, at least once a quarter, usually over lunch. "Nothing he does is ever just the thing it looks like." A year and a half after the typhoon in Busan, on a quiet Tuesday morning that began like any other, Camille sat across the breakfast table from her husband, watching him read quarterly reports with the same careful focus he brought to everything, and found she could not quite make herself eat. "You haven't touched your coffee," Du-hyun said, not looking up, the same particular attentiveness that had once tracked her preferences down to the half-degree of cream still fully intact 18 months into a marriage. Then he did look up, saw her face, and set the reports down entirely. "Camille, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She slid a small folded paper across the table instead of trying to find the words herself, her hands not quite steady, her heart doing something far too large for a Tuesday morning. "I think something's actually very right." He unfolded it slowly. "Read it once." Read it again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less impossible the second time. The careful, controlled chairman who had once stood in front of his entire board without flinching, who had walked into a kidnapper's warehouse with nothing but fury and certainty driving him forward, went absolutely still, the way he only ever went still for the things that mattered most. "You're certain," he said finally, voice rough. "3 tests certain." He came around the table so fast he nearly knocked his chair over, and Camille found herself lifted, laughing and crying at once, held against his chest while he said something in rapid, overwhelmed Korean she didn't fully catch and didn't need to, because the meaning was unmistakable in every line of his body. "I have spent my whole life," he said, finally setting her back on her feet but not letting go, forehead resting against hers, afraid of exactly this, afraid of wanting something I could lose. "My father went into the ground and left a company instead of a family that had time to grieve him properly. I told myself for 8 years that the safest thing was to never want anything that fragile, anything that could be taken." His thumb brushed gently across her cheek, catching a tear neither of them had bothered to stop. "And then a woman corrected my numbers in a boardroom, and every careful thing I built to protect myself from this exact feeling came apart, brick by brick, and I have never once regretted it, not for a single day." "Your mother is going to cry for a week," Camille said, laughing through her own tears. "My mother is going to move in and never leave," Du-hyun said, and the warmth in his voice when he said it told her he didn't mind that possibility one bit. They told Patrice over a video call that evening, Camille's mother shrieking loud enough that half the restaurant's dinner rush could be heard pausing in the background, demanding to know the due date, already planning a trip to Seoul, already, in the particular way of mothers everywhere, claiming grandparent rights before the child had even finished its first trimester. They told Mrs. Beek in person, the following weekend, and watched the formidable woman who had once warned Camille so carefully about a company that swallowed men whole dissolve into open, unguarded tears, holding both their hands across the low table where she had once asked Camille to promise to take care of her son. "He will be loved twice over," Mrs. Beek said, when she finally found her voice again. "Once for who he is, once for who his grandfather was. That is more than most children get, that is everything." The board, when the news eventually became public, sent a gift so absurdly large that Du-hyun spent an entire afternoon trying to figure out how to politely return most of it, an effort Camille found more amusing than the gift itself. Una cried at her desk and then pretended she hadn't. Han, still grateful for a second chance he'd been given 2 years ago, quietly arranged for the entire strategic finance floor to surprise Camille with a small celebration she nearly didn't survive without crying through her own makeup. The baby, a daughter, arrived the following spring, on a morning so clear and gold over the Han River that Du-hyun would later say it looked exactly like the light through his boardroom windows the day a woman in a navy dress told him, calmly, in front of his entire company, that he was wrong. They named her Patrice, after the woman who had built an empire out of a card table on Cascade Road, and taught her daughter to read a profit and loss statement before she could read a storybook, with a middle name, Hana, that Mrs. Beek had chosen herself, meaning the number 1, the first, the beginning of something entirely new. Du-hyun held his daughter for the first time in a quiet hospital room with the city stretching gold and glittering beyond the window, the same city that had nearly cost him everything in a flooded warehouse by the docks, the same city where a typhoon had taught 2 careful people to stop being careful, and felt the last frozen piece of himself, the part that had stood beside his father's casket at 26 and decided love was simply too expensive a thing to risk again, finally, completely, thaw. "She has your eyes," he murmured to Camille, exhausted and radiant in the hospital bed beside him, watching their daughter's small fist curl around his finger with a grip that already, impossibly, felt like it would never let go. "She has your stubbornness," Camille said, smiling. "God help us all." Outside, Seoul moved on the way it always did. Taxis bleeding light into wet pavement, vendors opening their stalls for the morning rush, the glass tower of Beak International catching the sunrise 42 floors above a boardroom where, 2 years earlier, a man who did not believe he was allowed to want anything had looked across a long table and felt, for the first time since his father's funeral, something in his frozen chest crack open and let the light all the way in. He had told her, that very first week, in a private room at Jungsik with candlelight and tea between them, that he did not know how to do anything halfway. He never had. He never would. And in the end, that turned out to be exactly the kind of love she had been brave enough, finally, to let herself receive.